Imagine sending your absolute best soldiers, highly trained conventional forces into a neighboring country.
Right.
Their mission is just, straightforward. Enforce a peace treaty, separate the warring factions, and stabilize this incredibly volatile region.
Sounds simple on paper.
Exactly. But then, within a matter of days, the peace treaty just completely collapses.
Yeah.
And suddenly, these peacekeepers find themselves trapped in a foreign city. They're fighting this brutal, full-scale urban war against an invisible, deeply entrenched and highly motivated guerrilla force.
And it's the very people they were sent to protect.
Right. I mean, they're fighting in booby-trapped streets, taking sniper fire from rooftops, and they have absolutely zero clear front lines and an agonizing lack of tactical intelligence.
The nightmare scenario.
It really is. And that unimaginable scenario wasn't a movie. That was the grim, immediate reality for the Indian peacekeeping force, the IPKF in Sri Lanka back in 1987.
Yeah.
So welcome back. You are stepping into the fourth and final module of our Connected OP PAWAN revision series.
And, over the past 3 modules, we've really unpacked the sheer friction of that reality.
We really have.
If we look at the overarching narrative of Operation PAWAN, we've traced this very continuous, albeit incredibly painful, line.
Right, from the very beginning.
Yeah, I mean, it began with a massive strategic mistake, intervening in a highly complex ethnic conflict without a clear political alignment, or really any understanding of the deep-seated animosities.
Which is wild to think about now.
Absolutely. And that strategic mistake immediately birthed an operational challenge. You're taking a conventional military force designed to fight other state militaries on open plains or, mountains.
Right, standard warfare.
Exactly. And thrusting them into a peacekeeping role that just overnight mutated into an irregular war.
Yeah, and that operational nightmare forced a profound tactical adaptation, right? Indian forces had to learn urban counterinsurgency and later grueling jungle warfare completely on the fly.
They really did.
Yeah.
And all of that blood, sweat, and tactical evolution yielded the critical future lessons that we're, dissecting today.
Which brings us to the mission for this specific deep dive. It's highly targeted.
Very.
We are adopting the roles of your senior military instructors today, and we are delivering a high-retention, exam-oriented final briefing.
So grab a pen.
Yeah, exactly. Because we aren't just looking at the IPKF to, memorize what happened in the 1980s. Studying historical battles in this way is a lot like studying a deadly virus in a high-security lab.
That's a great way to look at it.
Thanks. We're actively sequencing the DNA of the Sri Lankan conflict to create the operational vaccine for future counterinsurgency and hybrid warfare operations.
Right.
We're going to transform the historical narrative of the PKF into a strictly structured, exam-ready framework. Because, why does the Sri Lankan experience remain the absolute ultimate textbook for modern military operations?
I mean, it's because the exact same variables are still in play.
Mm-hmm.
Contested ethnicity, difficult terrain, severe political ambiguity, and that blending of civilian and combatant in hybrid warfare. These are the very variables shaping the internal security challenges we see right now.
Right.
Which brings us to the most vital, high-priority section of this final briefing, which is translating that history into immediate applicability for the Indian scenario.
Yeah, we have to bridge that gap between the jungles of the Jaffna Peninsula and India's own internal security matrix.
So how do we do that?
Well, to do that, we need to examine how the roots of the Sri Lankan conflict mirror, and in several crucial ways completely diverge from, the genesis of Indian insurgencies.
Okay.
Because if you're examining counterinsurgency or core operations, you first have to understand that the insurgencies the Indian armed forces have dealt with over the last, 7 decades?
Yeah, about that.
They're not monolithic. They do not share a single cause.
No, they are incredibly distinct, and our sources outline 6 specific pillars that define the distinctive features of Indian insurgencies.
Which is so crucial for the exam.
Exactly. Let's walk through these, because you can't fight an enemy if you don't understand why they picked up a weapon in the first place.
Right. The first pillar is contested sovereignty. And this usually stems from a convoluted colonial legacy.
Yeah.
The most prominent example here is Jammu and Kashmir. When the British left, the resulting partition and the accession process created this geopolitical fault line that has been contested ever since.
It's not just about local governance in that case.
Exactly. It's a dispute over the fundamental right of the state to even exist in that territory.
Right, right. And the second pillar, which is closely linked but distinct, is historical grievances.
How does that differ?
Well, many insurgent movements trace their origins to specific colonial policies, or the sometimes arbitrary drawing of post-independent state boundaries, or even just perceived injustices that have fermented over generations.
Oh, I see.
They look back at history and feel that the modern state is just an illegitimate continuation of an old oppression.
Which leads directly into the third pillar, right? Identity-based mobilization.
Yes, this is perhaps the most combustible element.
Especially when we look at the northeast of India. I mean, insurgencies rarely spring up purely over, like, tax rates or municipal issues.
Right, nobody starts a guerrilla war over a pothole.
Exactly. They rally around deep-seated ethnic, linguistic, religious, tribal, or ideological identities that feel existentially threatened by the majority or by the state itself.
Right. If an insurgent leader can convince a young person that their very language or culture is going to be completely erased, recruitment becomes terrifyingly easy.
It really does. And then the fourth pillar is geographic concentration.
Okay, yeah.
You don't typically see protracted insurgencies in massive, flat, heavily populated metropolitan centers, you know?
No, it's always the rough terrain.
Exactly. Insurgent activities flourish in remote, geographically hostile, and difficult to access regions. Dense jungles, high mountains places where the physical presence of the state and its administrative machinery has historically been really weak.
The Northeast and the dense forests of tribal central India are prime examples of this.
Yeah, the terrain itself becomes a weapon for the insurgent.
Absolutely. Then you have the fifth pillar, which is external linkages.
This one is huge.
It is. Because an insurgency isolated within a country's borders will eventually run out of ammunition, run out of money, and lose momentum.
They just starve out.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Therefore, several movements develop cross-border connections. They seek out neighboring countries, sometimes with active support of those foreign governments, and sometimes just exploiting porous borders for advanced training, illicit funding networks, or simply a safe sanctuary where the state's military cannot legally pursue them.
Like a reset zone.
Right. And the final sixth pillar is evolution over time. This is crucial for modern military strategy.
Because they don't just stay static.
No, insurgencies are living organisms. They adapt. Many transform from, ragtag militant movements into highly sophisticated hybrid organizations.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they feature both a lethal military wing and a highly active political, social, or media wing. They learn to fight in multiple domains simultaneously.
Okay, so let's take those 6 abstract pillars and, like, really grind them into reality with a specific theater analysis.
Let's do it.
We'll start with the Northeast. This is a region where identity-based mobilization and geographic concentration are the defining characteristics.
Yeah.
And the inception of insurgency in this region didn't just happen yesterday. It dates all the way back to Nagaland in 1955.
Wow, 1955.
Yeah, and from that initial spark over the subsequent decades, the fire spread to Mizoram, Manipur, Assam, and Tripura.
And when analyzing the Northeast for this framework, you must be able to contrast the conflicts that have been successfully resolved with the ones that are still ongoing.
Because resolution is possible.
Exactly. For instance, Mizoram saw a truly landmark peace accord in 1986, which is often cited in the sources as a masterclass in conflict resolution.
Right.
More recently, Assam saw a comprehensive accord with the Bodo factions in 2020, and Tripura just saw a major peace agreement recently in 2024. The Naga Peace Accords, first the Shillong Accord in 1975, and subsequently the Framework Agreement in 2015, with various ceasefires holding in between, have largely contained what was once a raging insurgency in that state.
But it's important to note the timeline here. The intensity of violence in the Northeast really only started showing a marked decrease from 1990 onwards.
Right.
And we still see the embers of insurgency in parts of Assam, Meghalaya, and Arunachal Pradesh.
Which is an interesting case.
It is. Speaking of Arunachal Pradesh, the sources make this fascinating distinction. They note that Arunachal wasn't originally afflicted with a homegrown insurgency per se.
Oh.
Yeah, it is essentially suffered from a geographic spillover.
Oh, because the borders.
Exactly. Because it shares borders with Nagaland and Assam, insurgent groups from those states use the incredibly remote and dense terrain of Arunachal as transit routes and sanctuary camps, so it dragged the state into the conflict matrix.
That's a vital distinction regarding how terrain dictates insurgent movement.
Yeah.
But you have to contrast those stabilizing areas with the current situation in Manipur.
Right, which is very complex.
Yeah, active insurgency continues to exist there, though its character is fundamentally morphed, according to the text. Recently, the violence has manifested less as a classic anti-state insurgency and more as intense intertribal clashes.
Primarily between the mighty and kooky communities, right?
Yes, the state forces are caught right in the middle of this identity-based warfare. And if you were required to detail the specific factions operating in the Northeast for an exam, you really need to know the major players.
Okay, let's list them out.
So in Assam, the historical heavyweight is ULFA, the United Liberation Front of Assam.
Formed in 1979, right?
Correct. Their initial goal was total independence. But over time, fractures occurred. One major faction entered into peace talks with the government, while another splinter group, led by Presh Barua, retreated to cross-border sanctuaries and continued armed resistance.
You also have the NDFB in Assam, the National Democratic Front of Bodoland, which was formed in the late 1980s, seeking an independent Bodoland.
Right.
Much like ULFA, sustained military pressure combined with political outreach eventually brought key factions of the NDFB to the negotiating table. That led to ceasefire agreements.
Yeah.
And there are smaller, localized groups like the Karbi-Longri NC Hills Liberation Front.
Okay, and moving to Manipur, the landscape of militant groups is notoriously complex. You have the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, and the UNLF, the United National Liberation Front.
And both of these historically sought outright independence, or at least vastly greater autonomy.
Exactly. You also have the KCP, the Konglai-Pak Communist Party.
And returning to Nagaland really quickly, the dominant force defining the political and military landscape for decades has been the NSCN.
The National Socialist Council of Nagaland.
Right. Formed in 1980, it later suffered a massive ideological and tribal split, dividing into the NSCN-IM and the NSCN-K.
And both of these factions have, at various times, been involved in complex, protracted ceasefires and ongoing political dialogues regarding exactly what autonomy looks like within the framework of the Indian Union.
Okay, now let's execute a hard pivot.
Sure.
We're moving from the Northeast to our second theater analysis, the Naxal, or left-wing extremism movement.
This is a fascinating shift.
It is. We've seen how ethnic identity drives the Northeast.
Mm-hmm.
But what happens when the state's biggest threat isn't ethnic identity, but sheer, grinding economic desperation and ideological radicalization?
You need a completely different analytical lens.
Exactly. The origin of left-wing extremism in India traces back to a very specific event, a 1967 rebellion in the village of Naxalbari in West Bengal.
Right. Spearheaded by working peasants rising up against oppressive local landlords.
So the roots here are fundamentally economic, not just identity-based.
Precisely. You have to understand the causal loop here for the exam. First, you have economic exploitation.
Okay.
For decades, wealthy landlords and moneylenders ruthlessly exploited the most vulnerable sections of society in rural India.
Yeah.
This created deep generational resentment, driving marginalized people to seek both revenge and refuge under the banner of Maoism. Then, layer on top of that, resource deprivation. The geographical areas most affected by left-wing extremism, the dense forests of central and eastern India, are ironically the areas most incredibly rich in mineral wealth and forest resources.
And this is where policy inadvertently fuels insurgency, which is a critical point.
It really is.
A critical keyword for your exam is the Forest Conservation Act of 1980.
Yes, write that down.
While intended to protect the environment, its strict enforcement practically criminalized the daily survival activities of tribal populations who had depended on those forest resources for centuries.
Suddenly, their very livelihood was illegal.
Exactly. Combine that with massive displacements caused by large-scale mining and state development projects, and you have a deeply alienated population.
Next, you add the absolute lack of education, healthcare, and basic infrastructure in these remote areas.
Just a total void.
A void that created a massive, desperate pool of unemployed youth. For a Maoist recruiter, an angry, unemployed teenager who feels discarded by the state is the absolute perfect target.
They just swoop right in.
The Maoists essentially step into the void left by the state. Where the state failed to provide justice or security, the Maoists set up, kangaroo courts, providing quick, brutal, but highly visible justice.
Oh.
They provided arms, they provided a sense of power, and they provided a twisted form of financial stability.
And all of this thrived because of the final cause, limited administrative reach. Civil administration simply didn't exist deep in these forests. The local populations felt entirely neglected, creating a highly receptive captive audience for violent Maoist ideology.
So, if you are the military or the security apparatus, How on earth do you tackle an insurgency fueled by poverty and lack of governance?
Right, you can't just shoot your way out of underdevelopment.
No, you can't.
Our sources highlight an incredibly fascinating operational metric used during the height of the conflict called the inverted matrix of success. I need you to walk me through this because it sounds completely counterintuitive.
It is entirely counterintuitive, but it highlights the operational nightmare the security forces faced. In this heavily forested, underdeveloped terrain, human intelligence was poor because the locals were just terrified of Maoist reprisals.
Right, if you talk to the Cox, you're dead.
Exactly. And because the state couldn't safely build roads or schools, they couldn't measure success by development.
Oh.
Therefore, historically, success in Naxal-affected areas was measured almost entirely by the level of violence.
Wait, really?
Yes, an area was considered under control if the number of ambushes, IED blasts, or firefights went down. That is the inverted matrix. You are measuring the absence of violence rather than the presence of governance.
Wow. And the sources point out the fatal flaw in that matrix, don't they?
Oh, absolutely.
Even when heavily armed security forces successfully cleared a massive tract of jungle and pushed the Maoists out, the operation ultimately failed in the long term because there was zero follow-up from the civil administration. The troops would clear the area, but the engineers wouldn't come to build the road. The teachers wouldn't come to open the school.
Right.
So the moment the security forces rotated out, the Maoists simply walked right back in. The kinetic victory meant nothing without civilian governance.
Exactly. And to permanently correct this cycle of failure, the Ministry of Home Affairs eventually adopted a comprehensive strategy that is absolutely mandatory for your exam recall.
This is huge.
It is the Samadhan Framework, SAMADHAN. This is not just a catchy acronym. It represents a fundamental shift in doctrine.
Right.
It embodies India's dual-pronged approach of applying ruthless security measures against the armed cadres while simultaneously flooding the cleared zones with aggressive developmental activities. Let's break down the mechanics of this acronym, letter by letter.
Okay, I'm ready. S is for smart leadership. But what does smart actually mean in a jungle firefight?
Good question. It means moving away from rigid, top-heavy command structures. It means empowering young, dynamic commanders on the ground to make split-second tactical decisions without waiting for clearance from headquarters, which might be hundreds of miles away. It requires leaders who understand both kinetic operations and the nuances of interacting with tribal populations.
Okay, then A is for aggressive strategy. And I'm guessing this doesn't just mean shooting more bullets.
No, it implies a proactive rather than reactive stance. Instead of waiting in fortified camps to be ambushed, security forces actively dominate the area through relentless long-range patrols, night operations, and deep jungle area domination exercises. They are denying the Maoists any safe haven.
M stands for motivation and training.
Yes. You cannot send a regular city police officer into the jungles of Bastar and expect them to survive, let alone win.
Right, they'd be lost in an hour.
Exactly. This pillar led to the massive expansion of specialized jungle warfare training schools, conditioning troops physically and psychologically to endure weeks in malarial forests while hunting highly skilled guerrilla fighters.
Next up, A is for actionable intelligence. The key word here is actionable.
Right.
Getting a tip that Maoists were in a village 3 days ago is useless history. Actionable intelligence means real-time data human informants, intercepted radio chatter, or drone surveillance that allows a strike team to deploy immediately and neutralize the threat before it moves.
D stands for dashboard-based KPIs, or key performance indicators, and KRAs, key result areas.
So this replaces that inverted matrix we talked about.
Completely replaces it. Now, theater commanders and civil administrators are judged on a dashboard of metrics. Yes, they measure weapons recovered, but they also measure kilometers of all-weather roads constructed, the number of mobile phone towers erected in red zones, and the number of bank accounts opened for villagers.
That's a massive shift. H is for harnessing technology.
Yeah.
The jungle canopy historically favored the insurgent, right? They could hide. Now, security forces use high-resolution satellite imagery, foliage-penetrating radar, micro-drones, and sophisticated signal intelligence to strip away the Maoist invisibility cloak.
Exactly. A is for action plan for each theater. Because the conflict in the forests of Karkhand is geographically and demographically different from the conflict in the hills of Andhra Pradesh, a one-size-fits-all strategy just fails.
It has to be tailored.
Yes. The tactics, the language used for PSYOPs, the specific development projects, everything must be tailored to the microenvironment of that specific theater.
And finally, N stands for no access to financing. Insurgencies are really expensive to run.
Wary.
Maoists fund their operations by extorting mining contractors, transport companies, and local businesses. So the state aggressively choked this off by monitoring financial flows, seizing assets, and moving the local economy toward digital transactions and zero-balance bank accounts. They are physically starving the Maoists of the cash they need to buy bullets and pay cadres.
And you must be able to articulate the results of combining this aggressive Samadhen strategy with massive coordinated developmental initiatives. The success hasn't just been marginal, it has been staggering.
The numbers are wild.
To give you context, at the peak of the violence in the 2000s, the Maoists controlled a contiguous swath of territory across central India, known as the Red Corridor. It encompassed over 10 million hectares of forested land.
They literally ran parallel governments.
They did. But look at the empirical data provided in the sources. The number of left-wing extremism-affected districts has plummeted from 182 in 2013 to just 18 projected by 2025.
That is incredible.
The massive Red Corridor has been shattered into a few isolated, shrinking pockets.
It's an incredible logistical achievement. The sources explicitly note that if this current operational pace is maintained, the Naxal movement is expected to be entirely eradicated from India by 2026.
Wow.
Because once you push a road through a dense forest and you bring in railways and suddenly the local youth have mobile data networks connecting them to the rest of the world,
Right.
and they're receiving central empowerment schemes directly into zero-balance bank accounts, you fundamentally connect these historically marginalized places to the national mainstream.
It changes everything.
It makes it infinitely harder, almost impossible really, for a Maoist ideologue to convince a young person that the state is their enemy when the state is visibly improving their daily life.
Let's shift our focus to the third and final theater analysis, the Jammu and Kashmir proxy war.
Okay.
This theater requires us to return to the concept of contested sovereignty, but examine how an insurgency can be externally weaponized. You must clearly explain in your exam how the situation in J&K fundamentally shifted from what looked like a standard internal insurgency beginning around 1989 into a full-blown proxy war.
The defining variable here was the direct, systematic, and state-sponsored foreign involvement.
Right. This wasn't just local youths picking up hunting rifles. This was Pakistan's deep state playing a direct role in recruiting, arming, rigorously training, and heavily funding militant cadres.
And then actively organizing terrorist acts across the line of control.
Exactly. This wasn't an organic rebellion. It was an external state using irregular fighters to bleed a conventional military. That's the very definition of a proxy war.
And the sheer scale and peculiarities of this externally sustained proxy war fundamentally altered the region's politics, its governance, and its daily reality for decades.
Absolutely. The state government apparatus was frequently overwhelmed, forcing the central government to transform its governance approaches.
Which resulted in multiple protracted periods of central rule, like governor's rule or president's rule.
Right, where the administration was hyper-focused almost entirely on security rather than civic development. It completely reshaped the political discourse.
Because for years, the debate in J&K was moved away from standard democratic issues like infrastructure, jobs, or education, and was forcibly centered purely on concepts of freedom, autonomy, and the underlying constitutional status of the territory.
Furthermore, the proxy nature of the conflict allowed external actors to internationalize what was fundamentally a domestic bilateral issue. Pakistan constantly attempted to leverage international forums to bring attention to the conflict, which constrained India's diplomatic and policy options for decades.
It's a huge factor.
But, and this is a critical takeaway from our sources, these protracted, highly volatile proxy wars can eventually act as the catalyst for massive, paradigm-shifting constitutional changes.
Oh, right.
Changes that might have been politically unthinkable in a normal, peaceful environment become viewed as necessary to break the deadlock.
The prime historical example our sources point to is the 2019 abrogation of Article 370 and the subsequent reorganization of the state into two distinct union territories.
Yes. This represented a dramatic, permanent reconfiguration of center-state relations driven by the need to fully integrate the region and neutralize the administrative ambiguities that the proxy war exploited.
However, a purely kinetic military response, just, putting more soldiers on the border, would never solve the internal dimension of the J&K proxy war.
No, the military strategy had to evolve.
The kinetic operations against infiltrating terrorists were heavily paired with people-centric initiatives by the Indian Army. The most prominent example is Operation Sadhavna, or Goodwill.
They recognized they had to win the narrative.
Exactly. This meant a massively increased operational emphasis on avoiding collateral damage, respecting human rights during search operations, and undertaking large-scale infrastructural development, running schools, conducting medical camps, and building bridges in remote border villages.
Simultaneously, at the strategic level, the government adopted a multi-domain approach. They addressed the core threat by executing targeted kinetic strikes against terrorist launch pads in the host country, signaling an end to strategic restraint.
Diplomatically, they built a relentless international narrative exposing state-sponsored terrorism. Economically, they choked the complex Hawala financial flows that funded the local militant networks.
Right.
And socially, by focusing on development and security, they worked to marginalize the ideological support bases among the local population.
So we have examined the Northeast, the Naxal movement, and J&K. What does this all mean when we map back to our core case study of PAWAN?
That's the real test.
This is the analytical leap you must make. We need to draw a sharp, definitive contrast between the Sri Lankan model of counterinsurgency and the Indian model.
Because on the surface, if you just look at the violence, the LTTE insurgency in Sri Lanka and the various insurgencies in India might look tactically similar.
Right, both involved ambushes, IEDs, urban combat, and jungle warfare.
But the strategic approach to resolving them, the fundamental philosophy of the state, was entirely different.
Let's clearly define this for the exam framework. You have to articulate the difference between Sri Lanka's exclusion model and India's inclusive model.
Okay, let's look at the exclusion model first. For decades, the Sri Lankan state legally and politically attempted to deprive the minority Tamils of their rights.
Yes.
They sought to actively undermine the Tamil language, culture, and access to state employment and education.
And when the conflict reached its climax during the final phase of the war, known as Elam War 4, the Sri Lankan military applied an exclusion doctrine to the battlefield.
Which was brutal.
They utilized unbridled, overwhelming conventional military force. Our sources state there was a total abjuration of basic human rights.
Wow.
They completely suspended the normal rules of engagement, treating massive swaths of civilian-populated territory as free fire zones. The military objective was the total annihilation of the LTTE, regardless of the immense, catastrophic suffering inflicted upon the common Tamil population trapped in the crossfire.
And from a purely cold military perspective, that brutal hammer approach achieved its kinetic objective, didn't it? The SLAF definitively wiped out the LTTE as a fighting force by May 2009. They destroyed the insurgency.
They did. But the strategic failure of the exclusion model is that the root causes, the linguistic disenfranchisement, the political marginalization, were never genuinely addressed. The physical enemy was destroyed, but the simmering political and social discontent continues to exist beneath the surface to this day.
Okay, wait. I struggle to understand this from a purely pragmatic standpoint, and this is exactly the question a sharp student might ask during an exam.
Let's hear it.
If the Sri Lankan hammer approach definitively won the war, wiped out the top leadership, and ended decades of terrorism, why is India so relentlessly committed to this scalpel approach of integration? When dealing with armed groups that want to destroy the state, how do we logically justify balancing hard military power with the slow, frustrating, often costly necessity of winning hearts and minds in a hybrid warfare environment? Why not just use the hammer and end it?
We justify the scalpel because the ultimate goal of the Indian state is nation building, not just battlefield victory.
Okay.
Creating a desolate wasteland and calling it peace is not a victory for democracy. India's inclusive model is complex. It is a difficult mix of political accommodation, the willingness to negotiate devolution of powers, massive economic development, and employing military force strictly as a calibrated, localized instrument. In the Indian doctrine, you don't use force to annihilate a community. Force is used specifically to prevent atrocities, to stop the disruption of normal civilian life, and most importantly, to degrade the militants' capabilities just enough to force the warring groups to realize that military victory is impossible.
Oh, I see.
It's about compelling them to come to the table for political dialogue.
So the military is basically just setting the stage for the politicians.
Exactly. And the proof that the inclusive model works is in the history books. The Punjab Accord, which ended the Khalistan insurgency, the Mizo Accord, which ended decades of war in Mizoram, the various Bodo Accords in Assam, These are the tangible fruits of the scalpel approach.
These groups didn't cease to exist, they integrated.
Right. The core philosophical lesson is that true, lasting integration of a restive population is never, ever achieved through overwhelming violence.
Which brings us seamlessly, based on that philosophical foundation, to our next incredibly high priority section, Lessons for India.
Yes, get ready for this.
We are going to translate all of this comparative historical analysis, Operation PAWAN, the Naxals, J&K, into a definitive 8-point answer framework.
If you are sitting down to write an essay on the requirements for future counterinsurgency operations, this is the exact framework you need to deploy. Let's build it out point by point.
I'll start. Point 1, political clarity. This is the absolute bedrock. Whenever a government is dealing with internal insurgencies or deploying forces abroad, the political leadership needs to be ruthlessly clear about its aim and objectives.
Ambiguity is the absolute enemy of a military campaign.
Yes. The political aims must be explicitly spelled out. Eventually, the Sri Lankan government achieved this political clarity during Elam War 4. Their aim was the total destruction of the LTTE.
But that clarity was sorely, tragically lacking during the IPKF's early days.
Right. The IPKF commanders didn't know if they were supposed to be peacekeepers, police officers, or combatants.
Furthermore, in a democracy, robust domestic political consensus must be built before deploying massive force to ensure the military has the backing of the nation.
Okay. Point 2. Defined military objectives. This derives directly from the political clarity of point 1. The military aim given to the theater commander must be crystal clear and achievable.
Because lack of clarity leads to varied interpretations by different units on the ground, resulting in a dangerous dissipation of combat effort.
The critical phrase you want to remember and use in your exam here is the danger of the creeping enhancement of mandate.
Ooh, yes, use that.
That is exactly what trapped the Indian Army in Sri Lanka. They went in to monitor a surrender, then they were asked to enforce a curfew, then they were ordered to disarm a hostile force, and suddenly they were fighting a war. The mandate creeped up on them until they were trapped.
Point 3, intelligence preparation. In conventional war, you know where the enemy tanks are. In counterinsurgency, the enemy is the population. Therefore, intelligence needs to be timely, precise, and immediately actionable. But more than just gathering data, it requires a structural overhaul. Effective, real-time coordination and intelligence sharing across all central agencies, state intelligence, and local police levels directly with the armed forces.
The IPKF went into Jaffna blind because the intelligence networks weren't integrated.
Right.
Point 4. Joint force integration. You absolutely cannot fight a modern insurgency in organizational silos. The army doing one thing, the police doing another.
It doesn't work.
There must be complete unity of effort and a seamless integration of resources. This means the armed forces, the CAPFs, which are the central armed police forces like the CRPF or BSF who handle internal security, the local state police who know the local language and terrain, and the civil intelligence agencies must operate under a unified command grid.
This brings the full, coordinated weight of the government down upon the insurgent networks, leaving them no gaps to exploit.
Now for point 5, logistics sustainability. A highly trained soldier is useless without bullets, rations, and medical evacuation.
100%. Security forces must be provided with the requisite specialized resources for the specific terrain they are fighting in. This means adequate manpower to ensure troops can rotate and rest, the right weapons for close-quarters combat, and specialized equipment like mine-protected vehicles or night vision gear.
During UPACON, the IPKF frequently found itself at a severe tactical disadvantage regarding logistics when dealing with the highly entrenched LTTE, who had spent years stockpiling weapons and building bunkers in their own backyard.
Point 6. Information dominance. In today's hyper-connected world, narrative building is just as critical as taking a hill.
Oh, absolutely. Proactive use of media ensures transparency and builds public trust, but crucially, it prevents the narrative from being hijacked by militant propaganda wings or exploited by hostile external forces.
We have to look at recent history here.
Yeah.
Social media echo chambers and viral protests have triggered rapid revolutionary regime changes in Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and Nepal.
If external powers, waiting in the wings, manage to exploit these disorganized street protests through disinformation campaigns, a simple protest instantly becomes a massive, uncontrollable national security risk. You have to dominate the information space.
Point 7. Population management. This connects directly back to India's inclusive model. A multi-ethnic, multilingual, deeply complex country must follow the politics of inclusivity.
The strategic aim should never be to alienate or punish any diverse group, but to respect and protect their unique identity within the national framework.
The military lesson here is the agonizing balance between hard security and civil rights. The state must be prepared to slowly, carefully transition from security-focused governance, such as areas operating under the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, or AFSPA, which grants the military sweeping operational powers back to normal, rights-respecting civilian administrative rule the moment normalcy begins to return.
Right, you cannot keep a population under martial law indefinitely and expect them to integrate.
And finally, point 8, exit strategy. How does the war actually end?
This involves the incredibly delicate, politically dangerous task of mainstreaming former insurgents and terrorists back into democratic politics. We saw it work brilliantly with the Mizo National Front, where insurgent leaders literally transitioned from hiding in the jungle to running in state elections and forming the government.
But executing an exit strategy requires overcoming massive obstacles. You face fierce resistance from hardliners within the government who want vengeance. You face the logistical nightmare of disarming and reintegrating heavily indoctrinated guerrilla cadres into civilian jobs. And most difficult of all, you have to address the deep, raw concerns of the civilian victims regarding justice and accountability for the violence committed during the insurgency.
Now, we need to take this 8-point framework and connect it to the realities of modern warfare and multi-domain operations.
Yes. Given the highly volatile, unpredictable nature of India's immediate neighborhood, our sources emphasize a critical, urgent requirement for the Indian military: the creation of a dedicated out-of-area contingency force, or OOACF.
The text is explicitly clear on this. Employing standard, conventional armored, or infantry formations for totally different, highly specialized operational roles, which is exactly the mistake made with the IPKF deployment, can prove completely counterproductive.
A tank commander is not trained to negotiate with a village elder in a foreign country.
Exactly. India needs a force specifically structured, uniquely equipped, and psychologically trained to undertake complex, ambiguous missions at a moment's notice beyond its borders.
The sources break down the OOACF requirement into 9 specific, non-negotiable pillars. If you are tested on future force projection, you need to know these 9 pillars. Let's unpack exactly what they mean.
Let's do it. Pillar 1, a concerted, consistent OOAC policy. The government must have a written, understood doctrine for when and why it will project power overseas.
Pillar 2, plans formulated under the ownership of HQ Integrated Defense Staff. This ensures that contingency plans aren't just sitting in an army drawer, but are integrated across the entire military spectrum.
Pillar 3, an apex-level structure. You need a centralized command authority that oversees both the intricate planning and the rapid execution of these missions, cutting through bureaucratic red tape.
Pillar 4, joint planning. An overseas mission cannot be an Army-only affair. It requires meticulous joint planning involving all 3 services: Army, Navy, Air Force, and crucial civil agencies like the intelligence bureaus and the Foreign Ministry.
Pillar 5, the creation of a division-sized rapid action force. We are talking about thousands of highly trained troops capable of independent, detached operations. They need to be ready to fly out in hours, not weeks.
Pillar 6, augmented lift capability. You can have the best troops in the world, but if you can't transport them, they are useless. The military needs massive augmented strategic lift capability by land, by sea, and by air to project a division-sized force across an ocean.
Pillar 7, embedded advisory teams. This is a fascinating modern addition.
It is.
A modern strike force needs diplomatic, legal, and media advisors embedded directly with the combat units. Why? Because a tactical mistake on the ground can lead to international war crime accusations or a diplomatic crisis within minutes. The commander needs a legal advisor on his shoulder before calling in an airstrike in a populated area.
Pillar 8, dedicated logistics chains. When you operate out of area, you cannot rely on the host nation for food, fuel, or billets. The OOACF requires dedicated logistical facilities and supply chains engineered specifically to support these remote contingencies independently.
And finally, Pillar 9, joint training. You can't just throw these different units together on the day of the mission. They require relentless joint training and simulated exercises that include all military personnel and even the civil agency representatives who are likely to operate within the unified force. They must speak the same operational language before the bullets start flying.
Within the broader scope of modern multi-domain warfare, another incredibly critical lesson highlighted in the text is the absolute tactical necessity of neutralizing insurgent or terrorist leadership.
Decapitation strike.
Exactly. Taking out the apex leadership can lead to the rapid collapse or severe operational degradation of non-state actors. It shatters their command and control.
The sources draw a very direct, undeniable line between the death of LTTE Chief V. Prabhakaran in 2009 and the total immediate fall of the movement.
They do. The text explicitly compares Prabhakaran's neutralization to the global impacts of the deaths of Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri of al-Qaeda, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi of ISIS, Yahya Sinwar of Hamas, and Hassan Nasrallah of Hezbollah.
When the charismatic or strategic center of gravity is destroyed, these personality-driven insurgencies often fracture and die.
And how do you execute those high-value leadership targets? You don't use a massive, lumbering battalion sweep.
Right.
To hunt these individuals, Indian forces have heavily shifted toward small team operations. But the application of this tactic differs drastically by theater based on the terrain and enemy behavior.
Let's compare them.
Okay, in Jammu and Kashmir, where the terrain is mountainous and terrorists often infiltrate and operate in highly mobile, small cells of just 2 to 6 individuals, the Army utilizes small, elite teams like the Gadaks, which are specialized shock infantry platoons within a battalion, or the para-special forces.
And these highly trained 4 to 6 man teams are incredibly successful at stealthily tracking, isolating, and neutralizing these small terror cells.
However, you cannot simply copy-paste that tactic into the Naxal areas. The terrain and enemy tactics are different.
Right. In the dense jungles of central India, Maoist insurgents tend to operate in much larger formations, sometimes company-sized groups of over 100 armed cadres.
If you drop a small 4-man special forces team into that jungle, they risk getting rapidly surrounded, heavily outnumbered, and wiped out in a protracted firefight.
Which is a disaster. Therefore, in LWE areas, small teams are primarily used only for deep penetration, covert surveillance. They find the enemy camp, report the coordinates, and then require a massive, rapid backup force, often hundreds of CAPF personnel, to build up a cordon before engaging the enemy. The terrain dictates the tactic.
Precisely. The terrain, the enemy, and the politics dictate the military reality. And to truly understand how political decisions dictated those harsh military realities on the ground during PAWAN, we need to map out a strict memory timeline.
We are not going to cover every skirmish here. We are focusing only on the decisive turning points that altered the trajectory of the war. Let's move to our chronology of events.
Think of this as your mental timeline for the exam. Let's start with the absolute origins. We have to look all the way back to 1956.
This is the crucial political pivot, the original sin of the conflict.
Yes. The Sri Lankan government passed an act making Sinhala the sole official language of Ceylon, while Tamil was systematically removed from that official status.
This wasn't just a bureaucratic change. It was massive linguistic disenfranchisement. It blocked Tamils from government jobs and university placements. This singular political act sowed the earliest, deepest seeds of the ethnic conflict.
Moving forward into the 1970s, we see the shift from political grievance to armed militancy. In 1972, a young radicalized Tamil named Bulupillai Prabhakaran formed a militant group called the Tamil New Tigers.
By 1976, this group would be reorganized and renamed the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, the LTTE.
The political and ethnic tensions slowly escalated over the decade, reaching a terrifying boiling point in March 1981.
Right. A Sinhalese mob, reportedly with the tacit approval of some local authorities, burned down the Jaffna Public Library.
This wasn't just arson. They destroyed over 90,000 volumes of priceless Tamil literature and historical manuscripts.
It was an assault on the cultural heritage of the Tamil people, and it deeply radicalized a new generation of youth.
But the true point of no return, the massive spark that officially ignited Eelam War I, was an event known as Black July in 1983.
It started as a tactical engagement. On July 23rd, the LTTE launched a deadly ambush against a Sri Lankan army patrol in the north, killing 13 soldiers.
The resulting backlash was apocalyptic. 2 days later, the Walikada prison massacre occurred in Colombo, where 53 Tamil political inmates were brutally hacked to death by Sinhalese inmates, while prison authorities largely stood by.
And that prison massacre was just the catalyst for the wider Black July pogrom throughout August 1983. Orchestrated Sinhalese mobs roamed the streets of Colombo and other cities with voter registration lists, actively hunting Tamils.
Over 3,000 Tamils were slaughtered. Thousands of homes and businesses were burned to the ground, and over 150,000 Tamils were forced to flee the country as refugees.
This massive collective trauma led directly to the dramatic, explosive growth of the Tamil militant groups. Overnight, the LTTE went from a fringe guerrilla group to a massively funded, highly motivated army of vengeance. Black July was the ultimate catalyst for the war.
Let's fast forward through years of escalating insurgency to 1987. The Sri Lankan Armed Forces, the SLAF, decided to end the insurgency once and for all. They launched a massive, punishing military offensive called Operation Liberation in May 1987, aiming to wipe out the LTTE strongholds in the Jaffna Peninsula.
They essentially blockaded the entire region to prevent a catastrophic humanitarian crisis and to signal to Sri Lanka that India would not tolerate the annihilation of the Tamil population. The Indian Air Force launched Operation PAWAN on June 4th.
This was an incredibly audacious move.
It was. Indian Mirage 2000 fighter jets escorted AN-32 transport planes directly into Sri Lankan airspace, completely ignoring Sri Lankan sovereignty, to undertake a massive humanitarian airdrop of food and supplies over Jaffna.
It was a blatant display of Indian regional hegemony, and it forced the Sri Lankan government to immediately halt their military offensive by June 9th.
That aggressive Indian intervention brings us to the most critical dates regarding the IPKF. Under immense diplomatic pressure from India, on July 29, 1987, the Indo-Sri Lanka Accord was signed in Colombo.
The very next day, July 30th, the induction of the Indian peacekeeping force commenced. Indian troops began landing by sea and air into the Tamil-dominated areas of Sri Lanka.
But the peace they were sent to keep was incredibly short-lived. By October 1987, the entire accord had unraveled, and the IPKF and the LTTE were locked in direct bloody conflict.
The spiral into war was rapid. On October 5th, a group of senior LTTE commanders who had been captured by the Sri Lankan Navy committed suicide by swallowing cyanide capsules while being transported, rather than face interrogation.
The LTTE blamed India for failing to protect them. In brutal retaliation, on October 6th, the LTTE executed 8 Sri Lankan police prisoners they were holding.
On October 10th, the LTTE ambushed a CRPF patrol, killing 4 Indian personnel, and officially commenced direct, coordinated attacks against the IPKF across the peninsula.
The Indian Army commander realized he was losing control of the peninsula and ordered an incredibly risky decapitation strike. This forced the ITKF to launch a daring, heli-landed operation directly onto the grounds of Jaffna University on October 12th, aiming to capture the LTTE leadership.
It was a tactical disaster. The LTTE had intercepted Indian radio communications. When the Indian commandos and infantry rappelled down from the helicopters into the university football field in the dead of night, they descended into a pre-planned kill zone of heavy machine gun and sniper fire.
Following that disastrous raid, the IPKF had to launch a massive multi-divisional assault. After weeks of intense, grueling, booby-trapped urban combat, the city of Jaffna was finally captured by the IPKF between October 21st and 22nd.
But capturing the city didn't end the war. The LTTE simply melted away into the dense jungles of the Vani region.
The IPKF would spend the next 2.5 years fighting a punishing, demoralizing counterinsurgency in the jungles, taking heavy casualties, before changing political winds in both New Delhi and Colombo forced them to finally de-induct and withdraw from Sri Lanka entirely on March 24, 1990.
After the IPKF left, the Sri Lankan Civil War resumed with terrifying ferocity. The subsequent insurgency phases, known as Elam War III and IV, raged on for nearly 2 more decades.
This period was heavily marked by the LTTE's pioneering use of suicide bombers to execute high-profile assassinations, devastating the political leadership of both nations. They assassinated former Indian Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi in May 1991 and the serving Sri Lankan President R. Premadasa in May 1993.
The brutal conflict dragged on, locked in a bloody stalemate, until a massive, completely unforeseen natural disaster irrevocably altered the military landscape. On December 26, 2004, the devastating Indian Ocean tsunami struck.
The massive waves severely devastated large parts of the northeastern Sri Lankan coastline. This wasn't just a human tragedy, it massively damaged the LTTE's military infrastructure. Their naval wing, the Sea Tigers, lost countless boats, coastal bunkers, and seasoned personnel.
And the Sri Lankan military brilliantly exploited that logistical weakness during the final phase, Elam War IV. The final, systematic defeat of the LTTE began taking distinct shape in late 2008.
The SLAF utilized overwhelming firepower and advanced drone surveillance. They captured the strategic coastal town of Punaran in November, and then the LTTE's de facto administrative capital of Kilinochchi in January 2009.
The Sri Lankan army systematically pushed inward from all sides, containing the remnants of the LTTE into a rapidly shrinking jungle enclave near the coast, grimly referred to as the Vani Pocket.
And it all finally ended in May 2009. The SLAF encircled the LTTE's elite fighting formations and inflicted the worst defeat of the entire three-decade conflict at the Battle of Anandapuram, killing over 600 hardcore Tiger fighters in a matter of days.
Finally, on May 18, 2009, LTTE Chief V. Prabhakaran, along with his top commanders, was killed while attempting to break out of the final cordon, effectively ending the war.
Now, looking at that sweeping timeline, a crucial analytical question arises. How exactly did political events like the 1983 pogrom or the 1987 Accord act as direct force multipliers for military violence?
You have to understand that military realities on the ground are always, inevitably, dictated by political decisions made in capitals. The 1983 pogrom didn't just kill civilians, it handed the LTTE the greatest recruitment tool imaginable.
It provided them with a massive influx of highly motivated, deeply traumatized youth who felt they had nothing left to lose, instantly multiplying their fighting force tenfold.
And conversely, the 1987 Accord, which was drawn up by diplomats meant to be a political solution, completely shattered the military landscape. It failed because of its incredibly ambitious, frankly, unrealistic implementation timeline.
Let's zoom in on the Indo-Sri Lanka Agreement itself. If you're writing an essay on the failure of diplomacy in conflict zones, you need to dissect this accord using an intent, implementation, and outcome framework.
Let's break down the intent first. According to the core text of the agreement signed between Indian Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi and Sri Lankan President J.R. Jayewardene, the overarching intent was to preserve the unity, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of the Sri Lankan state.
However, crucially, it forced Sri Lanka to formally acknowledge itself as a multi-ethnic and a multilingual plural society.
It specifically recognized the distinct identities of the Sinhalese, the Tamils, the Muslims, and the Burghers, who are the Eurasian descendant population.
The accord explicitly recognized that the northern and eastern provinces were areas of historical habitation for Tamil-speaking peoples, validating their core grievance.
So the political intent was actually quite noble. Preserve the borders of the state while forcing the majority to accommodate the minority.
But let's look at the implementation, the specific military dictates defined in the text. This is where the friction of war destroys the plans of politicians.
The accord legally demanded a complete cessation of hostilities across the entire island within 48 hours of signing.
It then demanded the complete surrender of all arms held by the various Tamil militant groups within 72 hours.
And simultaneously, it required the confinement of all Sri Lankan security personnel back to their barracks. Politically, it proposed merging the northern and eastern provinces into one large, semi-autonomous administrative unit pending a referendum by December 1988 to see if the eastern population actually wanted to remain linked.
Now we must critically examine the assumptions and the resulting execution challenges. The fatal, almost naive assumption made by both the Indian and Sri Lankan governments was that the LTTE, an armed, deeply radicalized guerrilla force, would simply abide by this diplomatic framework that they had barely been consulted on.
India boldly guaranteed the resolution and agreed to prevent Indian territory from being used by militants, and the IPKF was invited into Sri Lanka specifically, as the annexure to the Accord states, to guarantee and enforce the cessation of hostilities.
But wait, let's look at the sheer logistics of those timelines. If the SLAF was strictly confined to barracks within 72 hours, and the militants were supposed to magically walk out of the jungle and surrender all their hidden weapons caches in that same 72-hour window, that left a massive island-wide security vacuum, right?
Right.
How do you demobilize a jungle insurgency in 3 days?
You can't. It is a logistical impossibility. The fatal assumption was that the LTTE would happily step into a democratic political framework and become politicians.
Instead, Prabhakaran recognized the immense security vacuum created by the Sri Lankan army returning to barracks, and he stepped right into it. He refused to fully disarm, handed over a few obsolete weapons for the cameras, and consolidated his power over the other Tamil groups.
Which brings us to the tragic outcome. The Accord essentially gave the Tamil population everything they had been fighting for. International recognition, political autonomy, the merger of the North and East, everything except a totally separate, independent sovereign state of Elam.
But the LTTE's sheer intransigence ruined it. They failed to take a long-term strategic look into the political future. By prioritizing their immediate military ego and preferring to take on their very benefactors, the Indian Army, they fatally undermined their own political position.
Ultimately, 2 decades later, not only was the LTTE completely vanquished, but through their violence, they lost all the constitutional and political gains that India had managed to so carefully negotiate for the Tamil community in 1987. As our sources conclude, it was the greatest disservice to the Tamil cause imaginable.
Which brings us to the necessity of completely integrating the Opapawan experience. For your final analysis, we need to synthesize this complex historical timeline, the failure of the political accord, and the brutal realities of the battlefield into the classic three levels of war. You must demonstrate how they catastrophically interconnected.
Let's start at the top. At the strategic level, Opapawan represented a massive clash between India's grand regional security interests and its intent to forcefully solve a socio-ethnic crisis burning on its immediate maritime border.
It was at its core an honest, genuine attempt at conflict resolution by New Delhi. But it ultimately failed strategically due to massive mutual mistrust, inflated political egos, and the highly duplicitous nature of all the warring parties involved, with the blame for the failure unfairly shifted entirely onto the shoulders of the IPKF.
Moving down to the operational level, the theater commanders of the IPKF faced severe, almost insurmountable challenges due to the sheer ambiguity in their initial mandate. They struggled profoundly in the early months with a total lack of actionable intelligence coordination and severed logistics lines.
They were commanded and deployed as a lightly armed force thrust into a benign peacekeeping role, only to find themselves rapidly transitioning into a full-scale, division-level combat role against a highly motivated, entrenched insurgent force, completely without the right heavy weapons or specialized resources initially at their disposal.
And finally, at the tactical level, the junior officers and soldiers had to make a rapid, jarring, and bloody transition. They went from standard conventional military postures, training to fight tank battles, straight into grueling, close-quarters urban combat in the booby-trapped, civilian-packed streets of Jaffna.
And subsequently, they had to adapt to years of punishing small-unit jungle warfare counterinsurgency operations. If strategy is the political decision to build a house, and operations is the architect's blueprint, tactics is the soldiers swinging the hammer.
In Pawan, the political blueprint kept changing on a daily basis. The architects were arguing, but the soldiers were already trapped inside, swinging the hammer just to survive.
That is an excellent, vivid analogy to keep in mind for your essays. Now, let's move to our penultimate section, generating the final exam toolkit. We are going to consolidate this massive amount of information into the precise mental toolkit you need to ace any assessment on this topic.
We'll start by building your vocabulary with the top 20 OP PAWAN keywords. I will list these rapidly. You need to have the definition and context of these firmly locked in your mental locker.
Ready. Let's go through the arsenal. I'll read the first 10. 1. Contested sovereignty. 2. Identity-based mobilization. 3. The Salmon Hand framework. 4. Proxy war. 5. Article 370 abrogation. 6. The Black Shalaya pogrom. 7. Operation PAWAN. 8. The Indo-Sri Lanka Accord. 9. IPKF. 10. The Vanni Pocket.
And I'll read the next 10. 11. Elam War. 12. Small team operations. 13. Neutralizing leadership. 14. Ham-winning hearts and minds. 15. Information dominance. 16. OAACF out-of-area contingency force. 17. The inclusive versus exclusion models. 18. AFSPA. 19. Unity of effort. 20. The creeping enhancement of mandate.
Excellent. Memorize how those terms interconnect. Next, let's look at the top expected questions you will most likely face from an examiner.
You should be fully prepared to write detailed answers to. What were the specific operational, intelligence, and logistical challenges faced by the IPKF upon induction? What were the LTTE's core tactical innovations and initial success factors?
What are the overarching strategic and tactical lessons learned by the Indian Army from Opapawan? Why did the Sri Lankan armed forces ultimately succeed against the LTTE in 2009 when previous campaigns failed?
How does the Sri Lankan counterinsurgency model directly apply to India's internal security matrix? And what are the essential future operational lessons for a hybrid warfare environment?
To answer any of those complex questions, you need a universal answer framework. If you are writing any military history essay, do not just ramble. Use this strict structural spine. Start with your introduction, clearly define the scope of the conflict, move to the background, establish the deep historical context.
Detail the causes. Why exactly did the conflict ignite when it did? Provide the military analysis. Break down the campaign at the strategic, operational, and tactical levels we just discussed.
Extract the lessons. Be objective about what went right and what went catastrophically wrong. And always conclude with future relevance. How does this 40-year-old history apply to the commander deployed today?
And to retain all this data, use vivid memory hooks for rapid revision. Don't just memorize numbers. Picture the massive red corridor physically shrinking on a map from 182 darkened districts down to just 18 isolated dots due to the Salmon Hand roads pushing through the jungle.
Visualize the ticking countdown clocks of the 1987 Peace Accord,
Yeah.
a massive 48-hour clock ticking down for the cessation of hostilities, and an impossible 72-hour clock ticking down for an entire guerrilla army to surrender its weapons. These mental images will anchor the complex data when you are under pressure during an exam.
We have reached the final phase of this extensive briefing. It is time for the final 5-minute PAWAN recall. We're going to compress this entire decades-long operation into its absolute, undeniable core elements.
First, why India entered. India militarily intervened due to pressing, unavoidable regional security concerns. They faced the severe threat of a massive humanitarian refugee crisis, spilling across the narrow strait into Tamil Nadu, destabilizing domestic politics.
And they were bound by the legal obligations set forth in the 1987 Indo-Sri Lanka Accord, which was aimed at preserving Sri Lanka's geopolitical unity while simultaneously ensuring the fundamental rights of the Tamil minority.
Second, what the IPKF faced. They deployed blindly into an operational environment characterized by highly ambiguous, constantly shifting political mandates.
They faced a fiercely motivated, deeply entrenched, and ruthlessly commanded insurgent force in the LTTE, and they suffered terribly from a severe initial lack of actionable tactical intelligence and a logistical support chain that was entirely unsuited for a protracted irregular war.
Third, how the LTTE fought. They aggressively utilized heavily fortified urban strongholds to bleed conventional forces. They pioneered the devastating use of suicide belt tactics. They utilized the brutal execution of prisoners to sow terror.
They cynically exploited civilian populations as human shields, and when outgunned, they shifted seamlessly from urban combat into a highly effective, protracted jungle insurgency.
Fourth, what lessons emerged from the bloodshed? The absolute, non-negotiable necessity for clear, defined political aims before ever deploying military force.
The critical need for an integrated multi-agency intelligence sharing grid. The urgent requirement to build a specialized, dedicated out-of-area contingency force with embedded legal and media advisors.
The strategic imperative of choking militant financial networks, and the incredibly difficult, crucial balance of strictly protecting human rights while dominating the global information narrative to prevent hostile external exploitation.
And finally, future relevance. PAWAN proves, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that in an era of complex hybrid and multi-domain warfare, kinetic success, just killing the enemy, is never enough.
The state must constantly, delicately balance the application of hard military power with the inclusive, socio-political integration of diverse, alienated identities. Because true, lasting victory is ultimately a political solution, not just a military conquest. That is a thought to really reflect on.
This completes the PAWAN revision series. The next military history module moves from counterinsurgency warfare to conventional mountain warfare through the study of the Sino-Indian War, 1962.